It's a Thursday evening. The kitchen is clean, not because anyone is coming over, but because he likes it that way now. There's a half-finished cup of tea on the counter that he'll remember to microwave twice before giving up on it entirely. The television is off. He didn't decide not to watch it. He just stopped needing the background noise somewhere in the last year or two. He's reading. Or he's trying to read. Mostly he's sitting in the specific silence that belongs to people who have lived alone long enough that silence has become a texture rather than an absence. From the outside, this scene looks like loneliness. Sometimes, from the inside, it does too. But something else is also true, and it's the thing this video is really about. That man sitting in that quiet has been changed by it. Not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself, but steadily, in the way that still water slowly reshapes the stone beneath it. His attention has been recalibrated by having only himself to attend to. His standards for how he spends time, how he's spoken to, what he tolerates in close company, have sharpened in ways he couldn't have predicted. And his understanding of what he wants from another person, particularly a woman he might let into that carefully maintained quiet, has become simultaneously cleaner and more complicated. This video is about that man, about what that process actually does to a person, and about what it means for him and for anyone who wants to understand or connect with someone who's been reshaped by extended solitude. Here's something worth understanding before anything else. The changes that come from living alone for a significant stretch of time in your senior years aren't primarily about becoming wiser or more disciplined or any of the flattering things that narrative sometimes attaches to solitude. They're about recalibration, about what happens to your perceptions, your needs, and your tolerance when the constant background influence of another person, their moods, their preferences, their rhythms, their needs, is removed for long enough that you genuinely forget what it was like to have it there. Consider something small. When you live with someone, you adapt constantly, often without realizing it. You eat at times that work for two schedules. You watch things that land somewhere between both preferences. You modulate your tone when you're tired, because another person is in the room and tone affects them. All of this is normal and fine and actually part of what makes shared life rich. But when it stops, when you live alone long enough, those adaptations gradually reverse. You find out what you actually want to eat and when. You find out what kind of quiet you prefer in the morning. You find out that you care deeply about certain things that you'd softened in yourself for years. Not because you were asked to, but because proximity requires compromise and you'd been compromising so long you'd forgotten the original preference. This isn't about grievance. It's just what extended solitude does. It reveals you to yourself. And once that revelation settles, once a man knows, in his bones and his daily habits, what his life looks and feels and sounds like on his own terms, he becomes a different kind of observer, not a suspicious one, necessarily, not a cynical one, just one who notices more, who feels the presence or absence of genuine fit more acutely, who can sense, relatively quickly, when an interaction is draining rather than replenishing him. The question this video explores is, what does that actually look like? Not in theory, in practice, in the texture of how he talks, what he values, what he gravitates toward, and what he quietly moves away from. There's a version of patience that men carry in their 50s and early 60s that is largely social performance. They wait. They don't push. They let things develop at a pace that accommodates the other person. This is good behavior. It's considerate. It's respectful. But underneath it, there's often still a kind of urgency, an undercurrent of wanting things to arrive, to resolve, to become something. After extended solitude, that urgency tends to genuinely dissolve, not because the man has given up on things arriving, but because he has a working model of contentment that isn't contingent on their arrival. This is a meaningful distinction, and it shows up in concrete ways. He doesn't rush introductions. He doesn't compress the early stages of a connection, because the silence, for him, is not painful. He's comfortable with not knowing yet. He can have a good conversation with a woman he finds interesting and leave it genuinely open, not a strategy, but because his evening is fine either way. That quality of unforced patience tends to come across, and it's unusual enough in the dating landscape of any age that people notice it. It also means he doesn't respond well to pressure, real or perceived. If something is being accelerated toward him, emotionally, logistically, his instinct is caution rather than excitement. He's learned, usually through some combination of experience and solitude, that things that arrive too fast tend to leave the same way. When you've been alone for a while, your relationship with conversation changes. Specifically, the bar for what makes a conversation worth having goes up, not because you've become a snob, but because you've gotten used to the quality of your own company. This sounds arrogant. It isn't quite. What it actually means is that a man who has spent real time with himself, reading, thinking, slowly working out his perspective on things, watching the news and forming actual views on it, processing his own history with more honesty than he could manage when he was distracted by daily domestic life. That man has developed genuine interiority. He has thoughts he's interested in, and he's found that shallow conversation, the kind that moves quickly between topics without landing anywhere real, leaves him more depleted than replenished. What he's drawn to instead is specificity. A woman who has a genuine point of view on something, anything, really, and can hold it with both conviction and the willingness to be moved. Who asks a question and actually waits for the answer? Who can sit in comfortable silence and not need to fill every gap? He's not looking for intellectual performance. He's not trying to find someone who shares all his interests. It's more about whether a conversation has any weight to it, whether he leaves it knowing something he didn't know before, about the world, about the other person, about himself. That's the bar. It's not a high bar exactly. But it's more specific than what he was looking for at 35, and the specificity is the product of time. He thinks for a moment, actually thinks, doesn't immediately reach for the efficient answer. Reading more than I expected to. I started growing things in the back garden, which I never thought I'd say. A bit of volunteer work on Tuesday mornings. He pauses. A lot of sitting with things I didn't have time to sit with when I was working. She says she's been thinking about slowing down too. Then she lists everything she's planning to do and she does. He listens. He notices that her version of slowing down is very full. He doesn't say this. He's just interested in it. What it tells him about where she is, what she needs, whether the pace of her imagined future matches what he's already living. He orders another coffee. He asks her about the one thing in her list that sounded the least practical and most honest. Learning to draw. I always said I wasn't artistic, she says, laughing slightly. That's usually just a thing people say, he replies, when they haven't tried it yet as an adult. She looks at him differently after that. Not because it was charming, though. It was, a little, but because it was specific to her. He wasn't performing. He was just paying attention. One of the less comfortable realities of long solitude is that it sharpens your ability to read the difference between what someone says and how they actually behave. Not because you've become suspicious, but because you've spent a great deal of time being honest with yourself, and that practice tends to make you more attuned to where honesty is absent in others. A man who has genuinely sat with his own contradictions, who has looked at the patterns in his marriage, his friendships, his habits, without the defensive mechanism of constant company, becomes reasonably good at noticing when other people haven't done that work. It's not a judgment exactly, it's recognition. This shows up particularly around consistency. He watches whether a person is the same across different situations, whether the warmth they show in a one-on-one conversation is present when the waiter makes an error, or when plans don't go as expected, or when something doesn't go their way. He's not running a test. He's just paying attention in a way he might not have a decade ago. And because he's genuinely content on his own, the threshold for investing his time, his attention, his evenings, his emotional capacity, is higher. Not in a cold way. He's not performing discernment as superiority. It's more that he knows what the cost of getting this wrong is, and he respects it. Here's something that tends to be true of men who have lived alone long enough and done some honest internal work. They have a complicated relationship with admitting what they need, not because they're repressed necessarily, because the category of need has been genuinely revised. He doesn't need company the way he might have at 40. He's proven to himself that he can manage the practical and emotional dimensions of life without a partner. He knows how to be alone with his own difficult feelings. He knows how to make a decent meal for one. He knows how to fill a Saturday. What he wants, and this is different from needing, is someone who adds something that solitude can't. Not a gap filler, not a solution to an empty calendar, something more like an amplifier. Someone in whose company the things that are already good become better. He wants conversations that surprise him. He wants to cook for someone who genuinely enjoys eating. He wants to share something beautiful, a walk, a piece of music, a film that stays with you, with someone who will have a genuinely different reaction to it and want to talk about that. He also wants, though he may articulate this less cleanly to be known, not managed, not accommodated, not handled, known. There's a specific quality of being understood by someone who is not obligated to understand you, who chooses to pay attention, who remembers the small things, who asks the follow-up question that becomes, after years of solitude, is one of the more profound things a connection can offer. She's been having a difficult week. She calls him, and he picks up. He listens. He doesn't try to solve it. He tried that earlier in his life and learned it wasn't usually what was wanted, so he mostly just stays on the line, asks the occasional question, lets her get to the end of the thought. After a while, she says she's sorry for unloading. You didn't, he says. That's what calling someone is for. She asks if he's okay. It's a reflexive question, but he answers it honestly. He's a bit tired, he says. Had a long day of his own, though he won't go into it tonight. He has a boundary there, not a wall, but a limit on how much of himself he'll extend past a certain point in the evening, and he holds it without making it complicated. She notices. She doesn't push. And there's something in that exchange, the mutual respect of two people who know their own edges and don't pretend otherwise, that makes the conversation feel more intimate than most of the ones they've had. Later he thinks about how rare that is, how often he's been in relationships where honesty about capacity was treated as rejection, how much simpler this feels. If this is connecting with something you've been thinking about, whether you're a man navigating this stage or someone trying to understand a person who is, drop a comment below. I'd genuinely like to know what's landing and what questions it's raising. And if you want more content like this, grounded without the noise, subscribing is the best way to stay in it. This section could also be titled, What He's Actually Looking For, if you want the plain version. What he seeks, not a mirror, not someone who reflects his life back to him in an affirming loop. He's past needing that. What he's looking for is someone with their own interior landscape, their own passions, their own history, their own half-formed ideas about things, that intersects, with his in some genuine and interesting way. He wants the connection to feel additive, like the sum of two whole people spending time together, rather than two people using each other to fill what's missing. Practically, this means he's drawn to self-possessed women who are comfortable with their own company, who don't need the relationship to be the organizing principle of their life, who can leave a conversation and go back to their own world without it feeling like a rupture. How he communicates, more directly than he used to. Not bluntly, he's softened in a lot of ways, but with less hedging. He says what he means. He's stopped managing people's reactions to his honesty as a default behaviour, because he's learned, over years of living alone, that the effort of managing how you're perceived is exhausting, and ultimately not that useful. He also listens differently. He asks follow-up questions. He remembers things, not as performance, as genuine interest. He's had enough conversations that bounced off the surface of people that he values the ones that go somewhere. He tends to be explicit about what he wants and doesn't want, early enough in a connection that both people can decide with actual information. He doesn't enjoy ambiguity for its own sake, and he has enough self-knowledge now to know what he's walking into before he's too far in. What he avoids: relationships that require constant management. He's not looking for low maintenance in the superficial sense. He's fully capable of showing up for someone who needs real care and attention, but he's sensitive to connections that feel fundamentally unstable, where the baseline requires daily maintenance just to stay level. He avoids, usually without having to decide to, people who are not yet honest with themselves. Not because he can't have compassion for that, he's been there, but because the distance between someone who is still telling themselves a comfortable story and someone who has done the harder audit is real, and it creates a kind of friction he no longer has the energy for, and he avoids performing. He's not interested in sustaining a version of himself that doesn't exist in his actual daily life. If the connection can't handle the quieter, more ordinary version of him, the one who forgets to respond to texts before noon and goes to bed unreasonably early and would rather have a good meal at home than a crowded reservation, it probably isn't the right connection. Here's what this doesn't mean, because it needs to be said clearly. None of what we've walked through today makes a man who's been shaped by solitude superior to someone who hasn't. It doesn't make him finished, or complete, or beyond needing anything. Clarity about yourself is not the same as wisdom about everyone else, and the men who confuse those two things tend to become very difficult to be around. Living alone changes a person. It can produce genuine self-knowledge and real, emotional clarity. It can also produce rigidity disguised as standards, and isolation dressed up as peace, and a subtle contempt for the ordinary friction of shared life that is, actually, the substance of intimacy. The difference between those two outcomes is usually honesty. Whether the man looks at his solitude as a season that taught him something, or whether he holds it as a proof of something. Whether he carries his hard-won clarity with humility, as a working model that might need revision, or with certainty as a verdict. And for the women in this audience, or anyone trying to understand someone in this place, the thing worth knowing is this: a man who has genuinely made peace with solitude isn't someone you can convince into a connection. The usual pressures don't work particularly well. What does work quietly and naturally is being real, being someone who has also done some version of this work. Not performing ease, but actually having it. The connection that fits into a life like his isn't one that asks him to be less of what solitude has made him. It's one that finds that version of him interesting and has something equally considered to bring to the table. That's a higher bar than it sounds like. But it's also, for the right two people, a much more interesting meeting. Clarity isn't bitterness. Solitude isn't superiority. It's what happens when someone finally learns, at some cost, what peace actually requires, and starts to understand, with more specificity than they ever had before, what love should genuinely add. If this reached something real for you, leave a comment, share it with someone it might help, and subscribe if you want to keep going. This is a space for conversations like this one. See you in the next video.